All right, so thanks for coming, and thanks to the local organizers and to Alte for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to be talking about two projects that we have conducted at our language testing research group, Innsbruck, at the University of Innsbruck. And while I'm here sort of representing the group and talking about these two studies, I really want to emphasize that these have been a team effort, and you can see the names of all the people that have significantly contributed to this on this slide. I'm going to be talking about a particular accommodation for... Okay, it's not changing here, but that's okay. For learners with specific learning difficulties. These are learners that have difficulties with word reading, reading comprehension, spelling, written expression, number sense, and mathematical reasoning as per the DSM-5 definition. And these learning difficulties are unexpected given the intellectual abilities otherwise at the disposal of the candidate. And they have to be present for at least 6 months despite high-quality instruction. And they're characterized by differential working memory functioning, executive functioning, processing speed, and phonological and orthographic processing. And you can already see why some of this might be relevant for language or indeed listening assessment. The likely percentage of learners that have such a specific learning difficulty, like dyslexia, is higher than what was probably previously acknowledged. Cormus and Smith estimate that it's affecting about 10% of our learners. Okay, this is really weird. Okay. So SpLDs have some connection with L1 literacy skills. We've already heard this in Judith's talk. Lower L1 literacy skills are often indicative of specific learning difficulties. Okay? That doesn't mean that they're exactly the same, but they're often indicative, and particularly in countries where certification is sort of less clear and the diagnosing procedures are less uniform, it can function as a good proxy for identifying learners with specific learning difficulties. Okay, now it's not doing anything anymore. Okay. Let me just... I am using the clicker, okay, but it's a different slide. Okay, anyways, we'll make do with. And the relationship is there because they're both characterized by slower processing of orally presented information and problems with decoding. And Judith has touched on this very briefly in her talk, that the state-of-the-art identification of learners with specific learning difficulties is via underlying cognitive processing capacities, focusing on individualized profiles, and viewing L1 literacy as a continuum rather than sort of you have dyslexia and you don't have dyslexia. Okay? And that's what we also used in our studies, so that's kind of important to bear in mind. So all of these underlying cognitive factors of SpLDs, they have something to do with the underlying factors, of course, also for L1 literacy. There's been only a few studies, and Judith has again mentioned this, but those few studies have linked these difficulties with L2 performance, and reading difficulties have also been linked with lower proficiency in oral text comprehension. The study that Judith and colleagues have conducted found that low-level L1 skills predicted L2 listening performance, and that dyslexic learners perform below their non-dyslexic peers in L2 listening. So with all of these factors, these cognitive factors affecting low literacy or affecting L1 literacy, the question is, how do they affect L2 listening? And we have a mandate to create fair tests, right? We have this increased number of test takers with SpLDs, so we have an increased need to consider this test taker group and consider arrangements. But there's very little research, as Judy said, on how or what actually works. And that's despite us having this mandate to create fair tests, as is, for instance, mentioned in the AERA standards. So coming on to listening, this is probably your listening test experience, or at least it's the listening test experience for a lot of learners in Austria when it comes to like the high stakes exam. Okay, you have this sort of, you have every learner in the same room, you have this grubby old CD player, the teacher or the examiner hits play, the audio starts, and it's more or less sink or swim for everybody. Okay? That's what we do traditionally in listening assessment. It's administrator controlled, we would say. But if you think about how you actually listen in real life, I'm sure that authentic listening for a lot of you consists of situations where you, as the listener, have a lot of control over the sound file. Okay? You can decide when to pause on a podcast, you can decide to jump forward or rewind, and you can possibly even decide to adjust the speed of the speaker. Okay? So what does that mean for us in test design when we're trying to have authentic language assessments? Okay? So might self-pacing, this giving over control to the students or to the test takers, might that be a way forward for listening assessment? Both for authenticity reasons, but also potentially to help students with these L1 literacy issues or help students with specific learning difficulties. That's now increasingly more and more possible because we have digitally delivered language tests. And this would allow us to reflect these control options and allow candidates to work at their own pace. There's different ways of implementing this, but for the purpose of our studies, we have decided to implement it as allowing students to pause and unpause and to replay. Okay? You can also, as I said, technically we could also be thinking about allowing them to accelerate or decelerate, but we haven't for the purpose of this study. So the question that we asked ourselves is, would this be an option for an accommodation for learners with these reading-related disabilities? And that's partly fueled by some recommendations, well-meaning recommendations that are issued by, for instance, in this case, it's the Ministry of Education in Austria, which says for the exams, possible arrangements at the site of the exam, for listening comprehension down here, you may allow pausing or stopping of the audio files, also self-paced, and or you may allow 1 or 2 additional listening phases. So fairly casually, just sort of this one bullet point where you may do that, with no further sort of evidence or explanation as to how this should look like, or what this should look like. So that was part of the motivation why we thought this was relevant to look into. And I'm going to first start talking about one study that's published in these 2 papers. They were also on the last slide of Judith's presentation. This was a project funded by ETS a couple of years ago, where we asked ourselves, how do self-paced administration modes impact on scores of young L2 learners with different L1 literacy skills? To what extent do they use the self-pacing option? Does the frequency of this use have anything to do with their listening ability or with their L1 literacy levels? And is there any impact of this on anxiety in any way, and also the reported listening conditions? So we had students aged 13 to 15 from regular 8th grade classes in Austria, informed consent, and German had to be used at home. So it had to be their L1 in a way. And we had some exclusion criteria and ended up with 139 students after applying those. These students, after giving consent, took a standardized L1 literacy test consisting of a number of different tasks. And we had, so this is a picture of our makeshift lab that we had to set up in one of the classrooms. It happens when you do research at schools. And after taking the L1 literacy test, they also sat a group-administered listening test, which was a tailor-made research form of the TOEFL Junior Standard. After some familiarization tasks, they did a set of items in the standard condition, which is the single play, so they listened to it once, and then they did a matched different set of items in the self-paced condition, and we had a counterbalancing to make sure that sort of they didn't always do the self-pacing or they didn't see all the same items in the self-pacing mode. And after each listening, we gave them a questionnaire to ask them about their perceived anxiety and their strategies. Okay? And then we analyzed that with factor analysis. We got L1 literacy scores and anxiety scores. And what's important to bear in mind is that the self-paced condition, we made a deliberate decision to not display the questions anymore as they were self-pacing. So in the self-pacing mode, they listened to it once with the question, and then they could click next and could sort of do with the sound file whatever they wanted, but as they were doing that, they did not see the question anymore. Okay? And that's because we wanted to methodologically disentangle the additional reading time from the additional listening time. Okay? So I know this is a controversial methodological decision, but we wanted to see what just the effect of this additional self-paced listening was. Okay? But it's important to bear that in mind as we're interpreting the results. So first of all, you can see that the difference in scores, in average scores, was minimal. Okay? There's virtually no difference between how students performed when they had this self-paced versus the single play. We also then ran a mixed effects model, and this might be sort of overwhelming for some people, so I also brought along a graph. So to answer the first research question, what's the impact of self-pacing on listening scores? There is a significant interaction between L1 literacy skills and listening mode, but contrary to what we would hope for in an accommodation, it was actually the people with the higher L1 literacy skills that performed better in the self-pacing. Okay, so it's a case of the rich getting richer. It was actually disadvantaging the students with SpLDs, okay, which might have something to do with them not being able to see the question and sort of working memory load. But it could also be that they just didn't use the self-pacing, okay, we don't know. Well, looking at the questionnaire, they at least reported that they did pause, 75% of them. So the more of the darker blue, the more they did something. So 75% reported pausing, 60% rewound or forwarded, and 63% jumped to parts that they found unclear. But it didn't reflect in the scores in terms of any improvement, okay? So the test takers with the lower listening ability made use of the self-pacing options more frequently, and there was also a positive correlation between reading speed and frequency of self-pacing. Okay, so those that took longer, so had a higher reading speed, basically used more of the self-pacing. But that just goes to show that just because you make an accommodation available doesn't mean that it's used well. Okay, just because it's used doesn't mean it's used effectively. In the same way that just because allowing to use a dictionary doesn't result in brilliant essays. Okay, otherwise we probably could have saved ourselves a little bit of trouble along the way. Okay, so the more frequent use does not seem to translate into improved performance. And what's the impact on anxiety? Well, that was lower in the self-pacing. So maybe that alone is an argument for allowing self-pacing in our exams. Okay. So lower L1 literacy skills are associated with challenges in L2 oral language comprehension. These learners do need support in developing their listening skills, but they did not benefit from self-pacing in our implementation, okay? I want to stress this. The way this was implemented here, they did not improve or did not benefit. Because it might have been too taxing for the working memory resources, because they couldn't see the listening items. So basically, self-pacing is not a straightforward accommodation. This particular implementation seemed to even disadvantage these test takers. Now, would this be different if we didn't just use multiple choice questions? Does the item format play a role? Does it play a role whether they can see or not see the item as they're listening? Because if they do see it, then maybe their attention is divided again, and that doesn't help them either. Does age or proficiency level play a role? Many reported using self-pacing, but perhaps not extensively or effectively. So is this maybe an issue of familiarity, as we've heard earlier? Would they need to be trained, like in the use of dictionaries? And just because they're self-reporting, does that mean they're actually doing it? And the same with anxiety. Sort of, it was lower in the self-pacing mode, but it had little effect overall. So we followed this up with further studies. One of them is the PhD student, my PhD student Elisa, who's working on things like does the item format play a role and so on. But we also worked on another study that I would like to talk about now, where we wanted to focus more on this idea of does it make a difference whether they can see the item, and does it make a difference for anxiety. Okay, so how does an item presentation mode in self-paced listening affect test scores with varying L1 literacy skills? How does the presentation mode affect objectively measured anxiety? And to what extent is that related to the self-reported anxiety? So we had 42 learners of French, not English, but again with L1 German, and we gave them tasks from the Austrian school leaving exam, and basically we had condition 0, which was administered controlled with full item preview, the way they would see this in the exam at the moment. And the standard condition there is at the moment double play, so they hear the sound file twice. Okay, so it's different to the first study. Then we had a condition with self-paced without item preview, self-paced with seeing just the item stem of the multiple choice item, and then lastly self-paced with seeing the entire item. Okay, so 4 different conditions. As we were as they were doing these listening tasks, we hooked them up in our lab to a camera that analyzes facial expressions. We put sensors on their fingers that measure electrodermal activity. So if you're more anxious and nervous, you sweat a tiny bit more, and that conducts electricity better. And we also measured their heart rates with a polar belt, okay, as they were doing this. So that's what sort of the output looks like. What did we find? Okay, the average heart rate, the red line you can see is the baseline, which was them looking at a video clip of an aquarium, okay, just before they started the listening test, okay? And then we chucked all this data into a linear mixed effects model. Now, if that formula at the bottom there looks a bit like, I don't know, Anton is speaking Tamil to you, I'll try to break it down for you, okay? So let's take our example, a hypothetical test taker called Nick, okay? What our results showed was that as Nick starts the listening test, his heart rate increases, okay, by 4.6 beats per minute. When he gets into the self-pacing conditions, his heart rate decreases, okay, so potentially a sign of being less nervous. So just the very fact that he starts the test brings the heart rate up, the self-pacing brings it down a little bit. In the last condition with the full item preview, his heart rate decreases again, but not very much, okay? And working memory and word reading don't have a particular effect. What about the sensors we put on their fingers, the galvanic skin response? Again, the mixed effects models show for the candidate Nick, as he starts listening, the GSR peaks that we would expect if there was more anxiety do not increase when he starts listening. And as he's going into self-pacing, there's significantly more peaks. So there's more arousal in the self-paced conditions. Okay? So either Nick got really excited about all these functions that he has to play around with, or there's something else happening. Okay? So what does it mean? Heart rate is slower when self-pacing, especially when self-pacing without item preview. That's kind of, some of it is counterintuitive. What certainly contradicts this in a way is that there are more GSR peaks in the self-paced conditions. Okay, we would expect these two measures to align more. And what I haven't had time to go into, but participants do self-report that they experience less anxiety, particularly when they have the self-pacing with full item preview. Okay, so again, the self-reported and the objectively measured don't quite line up. Another thing that we found was that test scores are highest in the administered controlled tasks, so in the condition 0, and they decrease when they're self-pacing, particularly without item preview. Okay, so there's something's just not aligning here. So what does this mean? Well, there's probably more questions than answers at this point. The results, this was sort of an experimental condition, okay? There was nothing at stake, really. These were tasks from a high-stake exam, but nothing was at stake. So if the stakes were actually high for participants, would this be different? We don't know. It's very difficult to get ethical clearance for that, for researching that. The self-paced listening, just because they're using it, is that effective? Is there maybe something like familiarity playing a role? And I'm not talking about sort of the stigma that Pete was hinting at earlier, but do they need training in how to use self-pacing for an exam content? They might be familiar with it from YouTube and from Spotify, but maybe not that they're allowed to do this in an exam set. They're not making the most of it. And we're starting to ask ourselves, is that decision-making of when do I stop, where do I stop, is that actually putting more demands on the test taker? So are we actually helping them by giving these options? Yeah. When it comes to this objectively measured anxiety, do these biosensors actually tell us about anxiety and arousal, or do they tell us more about effort? And might there even be something like an anxiety Goldilocks zone? We don't want completely anxiety-free test takers, perhaps. Okay? And which anxiety is more important for us as test developers to take into account? Okay, are we relying on the self-reported? They feel less, or they report to feel less anxious. Maybe that's good enough for us. Okay, but it certainly doesn't align so far with this sort of preliminary study that we've done. But in any case, I think what these two studies show in conjunction is that these test accommodation recommendations, they need to be researched and they need to be evidence-based. It's one thing putting a bullet point into a document saying, oh, you may allow this, and not specify how and when and what to do with it. But it then looks very different when you actually look at it, and you might find that there's sort of a well-intended accommodation idea that actually disadvantages the very learners you were trying to help. Okay? And I think there's a lot more research necessary in these areas. Thanks very much.